Are you tired of every single buffer playing the exact same? Do you want a buffer that plays a little bit differently and has its own unique playstyle and cool stuff that they do? Well, go no further because we have Ui right here. Oh my god. So Ui is a duck type buffer who is up there as one of the best generalist buffers out there. So not really a specialized character, although has some specialized parts to it, but more a general buffer similar to Mami, for example. So what does Ui do? So let's go right here. We start with the skill because it's the most simple part of her entire kit. She simply gives a buff to all allies that increases their damage and increases duck damage by a little bit more. Now I said that she has some specialist stuff to it, but only like some parts to it. Like, yeah, you get a little bit more damage if you are a dark type character, but it's a really low amount and most of the damage still goes through even if you're not actually a dark type character. So it's a very minor bonus to dark type. Then we can move right over to her ability, where whenever anyone else on her team deals any amount of damage, and keep in mind that multi-hit abilities like Swimsuit Saika, for example, still only counts as one time dealing damage, she will grant 5 MP to herself. Awesome. On top of all of that, she also increases all allies' follow-up attack and counterattack passively by 30%. Now this is a pretty strong buff, and this is probably the biggest amount of niche stuff that she has, which is, of course, that if you don't have a follow-up or counterattack character, then of course this buff right here doesn't do anything. However, this is more so a bonus because most of the stuff that she actually does, specifically from her special that we'll see in a second, most of that applies to basically everyone. So you can still treat her as mostly a generalist buffer who provides bonus buffs to some few characters, like for example Ren or Homura, specifically dark type characters and or characters that have follow-up or counter-attack damage. But you can totally use her as a generalist character. And now since you've seen her ability, you might as well show you her support ability because it's basically the exact same, but like a bit less. So now basically also on everything else other than self grants 1 MP to self and increases all allies follow-up attack and counter-attack damage by 15%. So I think I mentioned this also in the video where she was initially introduced, that this might be one of the first, if not the first, support ability that actually is a team-wide buff you can put on as a support ability, where yeah, this buffs all allies. So if you have another buffer that you're using, and for some reason you're playing a follow-up attack but you're not using Ui, even though you have her, which you should. Maybe at some point in the future, there's another buffer who specifically is better specifically for follow-up attack characters, who knows. Then you can put this on them, and they will also be able to buff the entire team's follow-up attack damage. Awesome. That's future-proof, but right now in the game, I don't really see any point to use this at all. However, you could make the point about using the passive with the MP in some cases, but I'm not sure where you would use that, because keep in mind, all of the other buffer passives give like speed, and that's like extremely important for basically any other buffer, except for Ui, and we'll see why when we take a look at her special. So her special deals damage to all enemies and then applies a buff to herself for 1 turn, except this is not 1 turn. I need to tell you this right now. So this buff feels a bit weird. So this buff is extremely important to Ui, so you need to have it for as long as possible, and if possible you want to have this all the time, 100% of the time you want to have this buff active on Ui. But since it's tied to her special, that means that theoretically you could be using this special on her turn, and since buffs tick down at the end of her turn, you could throw this buff on Ui during her turn or just before her turn. Then she immediately gets the turn and then the buff would fall off. And that would be really bad, that she would immediately be able to lose the buff immediately. So the developers thought about that. And I've tested this, at least I have Ascension 1, which increases the duration of buffs, and I wasn't able to test it without this, but I assume it should work the exact same way if you don't have Ascension 1, where it actually works out that it doesn't actually tick down the very first turn that you take. So this doesn't actually last for 1 turn, it lasts for 2 turns. Or with the A1, it actually lasts for 3 turns. So this is a really weird way of doing it, where they're saying, oh, it lasts for 1 turn, but it doesn't tick down for the very first turn. But then just make it last 2 turns? You could have just made it last 2 turns then, because that's effectively the same? I don't know why they didn't just do that, but yeah, they say it lasts 1 turn, but actually it lasts 2 turns, which is important because, like I said, now you can't accidentally immediately let it fall off, and the timing is not that important. That said, like I said, buffs fall off at the end of your turn, so it is actually better if you use this buff right after one of Ui's turns. So let's say you use Ui's turn and Ui just got her special. Wait for her turn to actually be over, and you know her turn is over when the next character's turn starts. So actually wait for the next character's turn to start, and then use special. And then you have the full 2 turns on this ultimate, because like I said, for the very first turn, it doesn't count down. Then you have another turn to have this buff on you. And in that time, because of the passive, you're probably going to be able to get the special back. Meaning that even without Ascension 1, you're still gonna probably be able to have this buff on you at all times. Now, I talked a lot about how important this buff is, but what does this buff actually do, and why do you want to have this buff on you as much as possible? So first off, it decreases your own speed by 50%, which sounds bad, but like I said, you want to have this buff on you as often as possible, as long as possible, and taking a turn ticks the buff down. So decreasing your own speed is actually positive in that sense, because it allows the buff to stay longer. Now, you might then say, oh, but doesn't this make me then get a lot less MP to get more specials, because less turns means less MP. Correct, except of course your ability doesn't require you to take turns in order to get special. You're always gonna get special even if you yourself on Ui are not taking turns. Other people are giving you the MP, and this is why I say that Ui feels very special to play, because she takes barely any turns, but other people are pumping MP into her by just attacking. Awesome. That feels really cool. But what does the buff actually do for your team? Let's actually get down to it. Just a whole lot of really cool stuff. 30% in speed, 30% speed for everyone, which is the strongest speed buff in the game from a single character. Then we also have 40% attack, which is an insane amount of attack. Keep in mind her skill already does another 40% damage. That's 40% damage and then 40% attack, which is extremely high amount of damage increase. And then on top of all of that, she then makes makes other allies deal bonus ticks of damage to enemies. So how does that work? So it's worded a bit different. It's worded a bit weirdly. So when some other ally attacks, let's say for example Ren attacks the enemy. Ren is a void type character. Now it says right here the additional damage is based on the applying unit's attack. Applying unit just means Ui. So when it says 40% additional damage, it means 40% of Ui's attack. If you look at the attack, for example, the basic attack is 100%. So it's basically 40% of a basic attack is what's going to be happening to the enemy, right? And it will be as if Ui is the one dealing that damage, right? So when Ren attacks the enemy, Ui jumps in and basically deals another 40% of damage, of her own damage onto the enemy. Except there's a little bit of a weird part to it, where even though Ui is the one who basically jumps in and does that bonus hit for 40% damage that scales off of her damage, the actual element of that will be the element of the character that attacked. So in this case, because Ren attacked, even though that additional bonus hit is coming from Ui and it scales with her 40% attack and everything, the actual element will be void in this case. Now, I don't know exactly why they're doing this and exactly how that actually plays in with like weak element bonuses. Like if Ren has weak element damage bonuses, does that actually increase the damage then? Or does that only happen if Ui has weak element damage bonus? I don't know. I don't know how that works. I don't know how that exact works, but also with crit, does it play off of Ren's crit? Because I would assume it actually goes off of Ui's crit. There's some weird stuff here going on. But the important part is you just deal bonus ticks of damage. They don't do that much, okay? Ui is a buffer, and buffer don't have that much base attack, which means that these bonus hits won't do a lot of damage. They'll be just tiny little ticks that are barely noticeable at all. So overall, it's not going to really do that much. It's still better than nothing. Like, it is still a little bit of bonus damage, and we like that. So then we also take a look, by the way, at her ascensions. And her ascension A1 and A4 is of course the same as always, but the A2 then also on battle skill use increases all allies action roll by 10%. Won't happen that often because, like I said, you're not actually taking many turns on Ui, and whenever you're taking her turn, I guess you are using her skill basically whenever it is her turn, because she uses her turns so slowly that it's quite likely that her buff from her skill is actually running out between her turns. So you might be using her skill every single turn, which means that every single turn she gets, which isn't very often, is 10% action advance. Still not that much. But more importantly, now while you have your ultimate buff, you also increase all other damage dealt to weakness element. Awesome, great, nice, that's a nice little buff. Overall though, not that insane of an A2. Like as far as A2s go, like a lot of other characters like Mummy, for example, has a much better ascension too, but it's still a very decent A2. The A1 is not that important because, like I said, your special is probably gonna last forever anyway if you're playing her correctly. And outside of that, I guess it's nice with the buff from her skill, but if you use skill every turn anyway, then it also doesn't matter that much. And even with the A1, you still might have to use skill every single turn. So it's not going to make that much of a difference, and A2 is not that big of an increase. The important part is maybe Ascension 4. Now, don't throw all her rolls at her yet, because she's a standard character. She will be in the standard banner after end of October, I think. And you can just randomly get her, and that's the point where you hope that you get her at A4 at some point. But A4, her buffs are extremely powerful, and because her buffs are extremely powerful, applying a 50% on top of that makes them insanely more powerful. They're absolutely absurdly powerful with this, like insane. Like I can't stress how insane her buffs are with this A4. On top of that, she's gonna be able to use her special quite often if you play her correctly. Which means that every single special is 1 SP, and she doesn't even have to do anything for it. You just passively are generating an SP basically every single round. That is so good. So yeah, A4 is kind of busted. Aside from that, the ascensions aren't that important. Except, and we come to a little bit of a caveat. I talked about how strong the buffs from an ultimate are. Sadly, I know buffer ultimates usually usually make the buffs a little bit stronger, but only a little bit, but in her case, it actually is quite a lot stronger from her special. This is her special at level 1. So here we see 20% speed, 30% attack, 30% additional bonus hits, which goes up to 30% speed, 40% attack, 40% additional damage. It doesn't feel like it's that much more, but it kind of is. So yeah, you kind of do want her to actually have a high special to be able to have all of those buffs. So right now mine's only special level 4, and you're seeing that I'm missing some numbers, which is kind of sad that I'm missing all those numbers. So you kind of do want to actually increase your special once you actually get higher ascensions. So you're also missing out on that. Now her EX, I don't have it, but her EX basically just gives you 10% MP and 10% damage reduction when her special is up, which is not that important, but the MP may actually be kind of interesting. So now that I mentioned her general playstyle, what do you actually do once you have her? What sort of teams do you put her on? What sort of portrait, support, Kyoku? What do you actually do with her? So first off, since she buffs specifically Dark a bit stronger and follow-ups attacks a bit stronger, it of course makes sense you might want to put her next to, for example, a Ren or next to a Homura. Specifically Homura, even though she was the best attacker in the game, is now even more the best attacker in the game because she now has Ui, and Ui makes her even better. But on top of all of that, Ren, of course, is an absolutely fantastic partner, maybe even a better partner than Homura, because here's something about follow-up attacks. Follow-up attacks deal damage to the enemy. Now, why is it important that follow-up attacks deal damage to the enemy? Of course they do. Well, whenever damage dealt by allies grants 5 MP to self. Yes, if Ren, for example, does a normal attack, then triggers a follow-up attack, that's 2 times stealth damage. So you actually trigger the passive twice. So you get 10 MP from Ren attacking and then doing a follow-up attack, for example. Whenever any other other ally attacks and then Ren gets a follow-up attack, every Ren follow-up attack is another 5 MP on top of that. You can have an enemy attack your team, and then you have, for example, a Sayaka, and then Sayaka does a counterattack. That's 5 MP. And then the counterattack from Sayaka generates enough charge for Ren to do a follow-up attack. That's another 5 MP. You just gained 10 MP on an enemy turn, and because the enemy maybe even hit Ui, that's another 5 MP. You just gained 15 MP on the enemy turn. What? So yeah, on a follow-up attack team, specifically with Ren, because Ren gets so goddamn many follow-up attacks, especially once Ren reaches A2, where she gains basically double the amount of follow-up attacks. You get so many follow-up attacks that Ui's MP just goes so quickly, like it's insane. You're basically gaining a special, you're almost getting two specials between every Ui turn. Like, you get so goddamn much MP, it's insane. So already you can tell Ren is probably the best partner for Ui, but also Homura, also fantastic partner for Ui. Fantastic. But generally, anyone who does a lot of follow-up attacks, like Sayaka, also Sayaka is a great partner for her. But specifically, if you have Ren, you might actually still use Kirika, because Kirika's barrier deals damage to enemies, which doesn't count for her MP, because it's like weird types of damage. At least I don't think it counts for her passive. Actually, you haven't checked it, sorry. But it might also count for her passive. But the point is, Kirika's shield dealing damage to enemies also triggers Ren's follow-up attacks. And then, of course, Ren's follow-up attacks can also then once again trigger the 5 MP from Ui. So there's actually many different ways. Like, any way you have of making Ren get more follow-up attacks gives you more MP. And anyone else who does follow-up attacks, anyone else who does more damage to the enemy very often, also fantastic partner for her. And also, of course, any dark type damage dealer. Fantastic. Now, what do you want for her as portraits? Portraits, you don't want speed. So every single other buffer in the game kind of wants speed, but Ui doesn't want speed. First off, she doesn't need to take turns that often, because usually buffers need to take turns to get their special, but you don't need to take turns to get to your special. Outside of that, you only need to take your turn and often enough to get your skill buff refreshed, and you still get enough turns to refresh your skill buff. You can still do that. So outside of that, what else can you do with portraits? How about MP recovery rate? Because of course other people are keep giving you MP, so if you get MP recovery rate, that gives you even more MP. Sounds good on paper, but there's a bit of a snag that you'll have to play around. So this portrait gives 15% MP recovery rate. Does that mean you now gain 6 MP from her passive? No, you still gain 5 MP. Why is that? Because all MP gain is rounded down. So if you take 5 MP and you then calculate how much MP do you now get with 15% more MP, it's like 5 point something. And because it's 5 point something, gets rounded down to 5. Still only get 5 MP per follow-up attack, generally per attack. Bummer. You need more than 15%. So you have the portraits, which means you now need another 5%. Well, you can have, for example, her EX Crystallis, because her EX Crystallis gives 10% MP. That would work. You could have, instead of the portrait, you could have both the EX Crystallis and the 10% MP Crystallis. That's 20%. That would work, because 20% is what you need. After 20%, you would get 6. You could have a Kitika next to it, because Kitika gives 10% MP recovery rate if you have a barrier, which with Kitika hopefully you have all the time. So that would push you over the 20%. If you stack multiple of those, let's say you have the portrait and you have Kitika, and then you have her EX Crystallis, and then you have the MP Crystallis, that gives you like 45% MP up, and with 45% MP up, you actually gain 7 MP per enemy per attack. And then you have a mummy on top of that, who, depending on her special level, might push you over 60%, which is like 8 MP per ally attack. At which point, oh my god, we're getting so much MP. Holy shit. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea behind Ui, is that you're trying to stack as many different types and ways of getting MP, because then you can keep spamming your special attack, which doesn't actually do that much, sadly, until you reach A4. Because before A4, using a special attack that often doesn't do that much for you, other than, of course, refreshing the buff, which shouldn't drop off anyway, and, of course, getting a little bit more damage from the special itself. But more importantly, once you have A4, you are getting so many specials, and every single special will generate a skill point. So Ui actually becomes an absolute skill point generating machine once she is A4 and has all of the MP Crystallis, MP Portrait, maybe has another MP buffer, like I said, like Kiriko or Mami next to her. She generates so goddamn much MP, SP, you'll be swimming in SP. Absolutely fantastic. It's basically the final form of Ui. You also have the support Kyoku. Sadly, there's no support Kyoku right now that actually gives more MP, but in the future, I assume there will be a support Kyoku you can put on her that gives her MP as well. Right now, there isn't though. So what can you do? Well, you don't really care about speed, but basically everyone gives speed. So yeah, all of these are kind of bad, except Tsuruno, because she also gives Ryu better buffs. And that is why exactly you actually do want to have Tsuruno. That's the #1 support, and basically the only good support, because all the other ones don't really do anything. So yeah, because now your buffs are even stronger. Absolutely fantastic. You're basically using Tsuruno on her all the time. And if you have, for example, next to her a Mami, Mami usually takes Tsuruno as the support Kyoku. So in that case, you will actually have to give a different support Kyoku than to Mami, because Mami can have other support Kyoku, but we really can't. We really can only do it with Tsuruno as a support Kyoku. It doesn't really work any other way right now with the current characters in the game. So that is basically what you want to put there. Now, what else is there? Well, like I said, with Crystallis, you have for EX, you have the 10% MP, because both of them combined put you past the threshold, but you could also have just one of those, even just the purple rarity MP one. I don't know if I have it, but the purple rarity MP one also gives you 8% MP, and 8% MP is also enough with the MP portrait to get you across 20%, so that would already be enough. And then you're asking the question, what else do you put as Crystallis on Ui? That's a good question. We're not quite sure. because there's not really any other good Crystallists that you can really put on her. Like, I went through the list of all Crystallists and I tried to figure out which one you could really put on her. Theoretically, you could think about putting a lot of attack on her, because if you put a lot of attack on her, maybe her bonus hits do more damage, but her bonus hits are so low damage that trying to increase them doesn't really do much. But what might be a lot more helpful is to put one of the guard Crystallists on her. The guard Crystallists make it so that your entire team takes less damage depending on how many or how few enemies there are. And they can go such a long way, specifically on harder content like on tower or score attack or chaos. They can do so much to keep your team alive when they would otherwise die, that I think it makes a lot of sense that specifically when you don't have any other good Crystallists, to just say put guard on there to keep your team safe, keep your team alive. It's what I did with my Pluvia, for example. My Pluvia is rocking one of the focus guard right here, because there isn't really any other good Crystallist that I want to use on her, and this is just fantastic when I'm doing hard content for her to keep my team alive. And of course, yes, multiple character with focused guard, or generally multiple characters with guard, does actually stack. It stacks multiplicatively, so yeah, you can actually have this on multiple and your team will take a lot less damage. I think if all 5 characters have it, you take like 32% less damage or something. Like, wow, that's a lot of damage reduction. But yeah, that's basically what you do on her. You don't really need speed at all. You don't really need anything else. Attack, don't worry about that. You're not really going to do any damage. So that's basically what you're going to be doing with Ui. She just stands there menacingly, having other people, specifically with follow-up attacks, funnel as much MP into her as possible so that you can keep using special. Every special, of course, does a bit of damage, does a bit of break gauge reduction, refreshes the buff, and once she reaches A4, also generates skill point. And then whenever it's her turn, you're basically just using her skill, and that's about it. And she just stands there, gives also the guard passive, the focus guard or indomitable guard or whatever it's called, to the entire team with her Crystallis, and that's basically what she does. And how well does she do that? Because I've actually told you how good she is. She's fantastic. I think she's an absolutely fantastic buffer. Like I said, even though she specifically does more buffs to dark type and to follow-up attacks, she still does absolutely fantastic buffs to just general characters, because these buffs from her ultimate, 30% speed, 40% attack, 40% additional damage, and from her skill, the 40% damage, all of that is like, it just goes to everyone no matter who you are, no matter what you do. So she's a very fantastic general buffer who also on top of that is able to satisfy a niche. I would say that specifically if every buffer was at A5, she's probably up there as the best buffer next to Mami. So I think that generally Mami and Ui are the best buffers at A5. Moimura is not actually as good as these two at A5. So I would say that both of these two are right now the two best buffers. But there is a bit of a downside to Ui. The downside is that, well, on the other hand, you have Mami, who provides MP % bonuses to the party, which is extremely powerful. Specifically, once she reaches A5, she gets 20% MP bonus to the party, which is insanely high. That's extremely good, which of course Ui can't do. She only gives herself MP. On top of all of that, Mami of course gives action advance, and she has passive speed, which means that before you get to special, Mami already buffs everyone with speed. Same thing with Moimura. Moimura, by the way, I'm talking about A2 Mami. So Moimura also gives everyone passive speed as soon as the battle starts. But Ui only gives speed to everyone once she actually uses her special, which means that at the very first round of the battle, Ui still makes your team very slow, because it takes a while for her to get special, because she has 100 MP cost, by the way. So that very first special might actually take a little. And only then does she actually buff her team with all of that speed, which specifically right now on the link rate is actually really bad, because link rate you only get like 3 turns at higher difficulty levels, and the first turn of that is just getting to a special, so you're missing out an entire turn basically. So that's kind of terrible. And because you don't have action advance, you end up with, of course, getting more turns for your team with both Mami and Moimura, which Ui doesn't. That said, she makes up for it by having just the stronger buffs. I think just generally as far as damage increase goes, she has the strongest buffs in the game next to Tsuruno. I think Tsuruno still has generally stronger buffs for the team. And of course, as far as single target buffs goes, Mabiu is still better. But then next to Mabiu for best single target buffs and Tsuruno for best AoE buffs, you then immediately have Ui coming after that for best general buffs for everyone. And then only after that would be Mami, I think. So yeah, overall she seems pretty powerful. Do you have to roll for her? No, specifically because most people already have Mummy at this point, even A2 Mummy. Specifically, once you have A2 Mummy, you don't really need to worry that much about getting an Ui. And because she's standard character, you'll probably get her at some point in the future after October. And also, I mentioned this before, it's quite likely that Nagisa and maybe even Akumura may be somewhat soon-ish within the next 2 or 3 months, so keep all of that in mind if you want to save for that. But yeah, that was that. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, become a member, and shoutouts to member as always, Rip van Winkel and Simple Thor. See you guys next time.